Welcome to one of the most calculated acts of revenge ever documented in American history. Before we continue, comment below where you are watching from and the exact time you are hearing this story. We want to know where and when these forgotten truths are being discovered. On the morning of November 3, 1851, 7 of the wealthiest sugar plantation owners in St. Mary Parish, Louisiana, failed to arrive at a scheduled meeting in Franklin, the parish seat. This was unusual. These men, known collectively as the Sugar Council, never missed their monthly gatherings. They controlled nearly 40,000 acres of prime sugarcane land along Bayou Teche. They owned over 800 enslaved people. Their punctuality was legendary. Their power was absolute. Their cruelty was notorious. When concerned associates went to investigate, they found something that would haunt Louisiana for generations. The 7 men had vanished. Their homes showed no signs of struggle. Their families had no explanation. Their horses were still in their stables. Their personal effects remained untouched. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. The search lasted 3 weeks. Hundreds of people combed the bayous and cane fields. Bloodhounds tracked scents that led nowhere. Boats dragged the murky waters of Bayou Teche. The mystery deepened with each passing day. Panic began to spread through the planter class. If 7 of the most powerful men in the parish could vanish without a trace, what did that mean for everyone else? Then, on November 24th, a field supervisor at Beaumont Plantation made a discovery that turned the missing persons case into something far more sinister. Something that would be whispered about in parlors and slave quarters alike for decades to come. The bodies were found in the Molasses Vats. 7 men, drowned in thick, dark syrup, preserved perfectly by the sugar content. Their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror, their hands raised as if trying to claw their way out of the viscous liquid that had slowly suffocated them. Their fine clothes soaked through with sweetness, their mouths and lungs filled with the very substance that had made them wealthy. The official investigation concluded it was a tragic accident. 7 men touring the processing facility together. A railing that gave way, a collective fall into the open vats. It was implausible, borderline impossible, but the alternative was too terrifying to acknowledge publicly, too dangerous to even consider. The alternative was murder. Deliberate, calculated, methodical murder orchestrated by a man named Moses. An enslaved person who had spent 5 years planning the perfect revenge. A man who understood that in Louisiana sugar country, molasses was everywhere. In the grinding mills, in the boiling rooms, in the massive storage vats that could hold thousands of gallons. And in those vats, a person could drown slowly, unable to swim in the thick syrup. Unable to call for help as the sweet liquid filled their lungs, unable to do anything but sink and suffocate and die. This is the story of Moses, a story that exists only in fragments, in sealed court documents that were never meant to see daylight, in letters marked confidential and buried in family archives, in whispered accounts passed down through generations of families who knew the truth but were too afraid to speak it publicly. A story that Louisiana has spent over a century and a half trying to erase from history. St. Mary Parish in 1851 was the beating heart of Louisiana's sugar empire. The rich alluvial soil along Bayou Teche, deposited by centuries of flooding from the Mississippi River system, was perfect for sugarcane cultivation. The climate provided exactly the right combination of scorching heat, oppressive humidity, and seasonal rainfall. And the brutal system of slave labor provided the massive workforce necessary to turn cane into the white gold that made fortunes for a small number of white families. Sugar production was fundamentally different from cotton cultivation. More complex, more capital-intensive, more immediately brutal. Where cotton plantations might work their enslaved people hard during picking season, sugar plantations drove them to the edge of human endurance for months at a time. The harvest season, which ran from October through January, was a period of unrelenting labor that broke bodies and crushed spirits with systematic efficiency. The process began in the fields. Enslaved people worked in gangs, cutting mature cane with machetes. The stalks were heavy, the leaves were sharp, the work was backbreaking. They cut from dawn until well after dark, their hands bleeding, their backs screaming in agony, their bodies pushed beyond what should be humanly possible. But the cutting was only the beginning. Once cut, sugarcane begins to lose its sugar content within hours. This meant speed was essential, absolute, non-negotiable. The cut cane had to be transported immediately to the grinding mills. The juice had to be extracted quickly. The boiling process had to begin without delay. Any hesitation, any slowdown, any moment of rest meant lost profits, and lost profits were unacceptable. So the enslaved workforce was divided into shifts that worked around the clock during harvest. Some cut cane in the fields. Others fed the stalks into the grinding mills, massive machines powered by steam engines that crushed the cane and extracted the juice. Still others worked in the boiling rooms, tending enormous kettles where the juice was heated to increasingly high temperatures, gradually concentrating the sugar content. The work in the boiling rooms was particularly hellish. The temperature routinely exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with steam and the cloying smell of boiling sugar. Workers stood for 18 to 20-hour shifts, stirring massive kettles with long wooden paddles, transferring the thickening syrup from one kettle to another as the water evaporated and the sugar concentrated. Burns were constant. The boiling syrup could reach temperatures of 240 degrees. A single splash could cause third-degree burns. Many enslaved people bore scars from these burns, permanent reminders of the dangerous work they were forced to perform. Some lost fingers or hands when exhaustion caused them to slip and fall against the kettles. A few were killed when they collapsed from heat exhaustion and fell into the boiling liquid. And through it all, the overseers watched, whips in hand, ready to punish any slowdown, any perceived laziness, any moment of weakness. The pace never slowed. The work never stopped. Because the season was short, and the profits were enormous, and the men who owned these plantations were determined to extract every possible penny from the land and the people they exploited. The 7 men who formed the Sugar Council were the undisputed masters of this system. They had refined it, perfected it, made it more efficient and more profitable than anyone thought possible. And they had grown wealthy beyond imagination in the process. Their names were recorded in parish records, though later efforts would be made to obscure them, to minimize their prominence in official histories. William Beaumont, owner of Beaumont Plantation, 3,000 acres and 243 enslaved people. Charles Dupree of Belle Grove, 2,500 acres and 191 enslaved people. Antoine Laveau of Grand Cane, 2,800 acres and 207 enslaved people. James Robertson of Oaklawn, 2,000 acres and 164 enslaved people. Henri Dufour of Petit Bois, 1,900 acres and 148 enslaved people. Samuel Porter of Riverbend, 2,200 acres and 173 enslaved people. And Thomas Guidry of Sweetwater, 2,600 acres, and 189 enslaved people. 7 men who collectively controlled over 18,000 acres of prime Louisiana sugarcane land. 7 men who owned the lives of over 1,300 human beings. 7 men who coordinated their operations to maximize profits and minimize costs. 7 men who met monthly to discuss business, share strategies, and congratulate each other on their success. They set harvest schedules together, ensuring they did not compete for the limited number of skilled workers in the parish. They coordinated their shipping, securing better rates by pooling their molasses and sugar for transport to New Orleans. They shared overseers and slave catchers, creating an informal network of control that made escape nearly impossible. They even arranged marriages between their children, consolidating their power into an interconnected web of family and financial ties. And they were known, even by the brutal standards of antebellum Louisiana, for their exceptional cruelty, for their willingness to work enslaved people to death during harvest season and simply purchase replacements, for their creative punishments, for their absolute conviction that the people they enslaved were property, not humans, and could be treated with the same consideration one might give livestock or machinery. Moses was born into this system around 1816. His mother, whose name was recorded only as Ruth in plantation ledgers, worked in the Beaumont plantation kitchen. She was valued property, skilled in cooking the elaborate meals that plantation mistresses served to impress their guests. But like all enslaved women, she had no protection from the sexual violence that was endemic to the system. Moses' father was unknown. The records do not say whether he was another enslaved person, a white overseer, or William Beaumont himself. They rarely bothered recording such details about people they considered property. What mattered was that Ruth had produced a healthy male child who would eventually be valuable labor. The circumstances of his conception were irrelevant to people who saw enslaved women primarily as breeding stock. Moses grew up in the shadow of the sugar operation. By age 7, he was carrying water to field workers during the brutal Louisiana summers. By 10, he was helping in the grinding mill, learning the dangerous machinery that could crush a man's hand as easily as it crushed cane. By 15, he was working full shifts during harvest season, learning every aspect of sugar production from the cutting to the final stages of processing. He was, according to the few descriptions that exist in plantation records and later testimony, a tall man, strong, quiet, observant, the sort of person who blended into the background, who performed his work competently but without drawing attention, who rarely spoke unless spoken to, who kept his thoughts and feelings hidden behind an expression of careful neutrality. This was survival, in a system where any sign of intelligence or independent thought could be punished brutally, where reading or writing could result in having fingers cut off, where even looking at a white person the wrong way might earn a whipping. Moses had learned to hide himself, to appear simple, obedient, unthreatening, to be exactly what his masters expected a good slave to be. But behind that carefully maintained mask, something else existed. A mind that observed everything, that understood the complex social dynamics of the plantation in ways his masters never suspected, that recognized patterns in behavior and routine, that could plan years into the future with patience that would have impressed any military strategist. Moses watched how the plantation operated, who had power and who did not, which overseers were cruel and which merely went through the motions, which white people could be manipulated with apparent deference and which were genuinely dangerous. He learned the schedules and routines, knew when the masters would be where, understood the rhythms of plantation life better than the people who thought they controlled it. He also learned about sugar production in exhaustive detail, not just the basic processes, but the engineering, the chemistry, the dangers. He understood how the grinding mills worked, the precise pressures required, the ways they could malfunction. He knew the temperatures needed for proper boiling, the stages the syrup went through as water evaporated and sugar concentrated. And he learned about the storage vats, the massive containers where finished molasses waited to be shipped to New Orleans. These vats were engineering marvels for their time, made of heavy-gauge iron, reinforced with steel bands, 10 feet deep and 8 feet in diameter, capable of holding 4,000 gallons of molasses, equipped with valves at the bottom for draining and filling, surrounded by observation platforms so supervisors could check the filling levels and quality. Moses knew every detail of these vats, their dimensions, their construction, their placement in the processing building. Most importantly, he understood the nature of molasses itself. At room temperature, molasses is roughly 3,000 times more viscous than water. It does not flow easily. Objects do not float in it. A person who fell into a vat of molasses would sink slowly, pulled down by their own weight and the weight of their clothing as it became saturated with the thick liquid. They would not be able to swim. The syrup was too dense, too resistant to movement. They would not be able to climb out. The smooth metal walls of the vat offered no handholds, and hands coated in sticky molasses could not grip anything effectively. They would simply sink. Struggling would only exhaust them faster. And as they sank, the molasses would work into their nose, their mouth, their lungs. They would drown slowly, suffocated by sweetness, unable to scream for help because their airways would be blocked by thick syrup. It was, Moses realized, the perfect murder weapon. Abundant, always present during harvest season, dangerous in ways that could plausibly be explained as accidental, and absolutely, perfectly lethal. But Moses did not rush to use this knowledge, did not act impulsively, because he understood that rushing would lead to failure, would result in his own death, and accomplish nothing. True revenge required patience, planning, the right circumstances, the perfect opportunity. And then, in October 1846, happened that something that gave him a target and a motivation that would sustain him through 5 years of careful preparation. His sister Hannah was 22 years old. She worked in the Beaumont mansion as a house servant. She had been born on the plantation, just like Moses, had grown up alongside him in the slave quarters. They were close in the way siblings could be, even in a system designed to destroy family bonds. They protected each other, looked out for each other, were each other's only real family in a world that treated them as property. William Beaumont had a son named Edward, 24 years old, home from college in New Orleans for the harvest season. Handsome, charming, educated. Everything a young man of his class was supposed to be. And like many such young men, he believed that enslaved women existed for his pleasure, that he could take whatever he wanted without consequence. What happened between Edward Beaumont and Hannah was recorded only obliquely in plantation documents. A notation in William Beaumont's personal journal, dated October 15, 1846, states simply, "Edward has gotten the girl Hannah with child, an inconvenience. Have arranged for her sale to Laveau at Grand Cane. The matter will be handled discreetly so as not to reflect poorly on the family." Hannah was sold away 5 days later, pregnant with Edward Beaumont's child. Sold to Antoine Laveau's plantation, 15 miles down Bayou Teche. The sale was permanent. There would be no visiting, no contact, no possibility of ever seeing her brother again. She was property being transferred from one owner to another. Her feelings, her relationships, her very humanity were irrelevant to the transaction. Moses learned of her fate from another enslaved person who had overheard the arrangements being made. Hannah had tried to resist, had begged not to be separated from her brother, the only family she had left, had been whipped for her protests, 20 lashes across her back, and then she had been dragged to Laveau's plantation in chains, her screams echoing across the cane fields as she was taken away. Most enslaved people, faced with such horror, would have had no recourse, no way to fight back, no means of seeking justice, no avenue for revenge. Moses had the same lack of options. He could not confront Edward Beaumont without being killed, could not appeal to William Beaumont without being punished, could not even speak of his rage without risking everything. But unlike many, he did not accept powerlessness. He did not let the crushing weight of the system break his spirit. Instead, something cold and calculating settled into his mind, a determination that would sustain him through years of planning, a vision so clear and so terrible that when it finally came to fruition, it would shock even those who thought they understood the depths of human vengeance. Moses decided that night that he would kill William Beaumont, would kill Edward Beaumont, would kill every man who was part of the system that had destroyed his sister. And he would do it in a way that would go unpunished. That would appear accidental. That would allow him to walk away free. It was an impossible goal. But Moses had something his masters did not. He had time. He had patience. And he had nothing left to lose. The first documented evidence of Moses' planning appears in testimony given years later by an enslaved woman named Celia. Celia worked in the Beaumont kitchen alongside Moses' mother Ruth. In a statement recorded in 1866, after the Civil War had ended, and she was no longer afraid of punishment for speaking, Celia described a conversation with Moses in November 1846, just weeks after Hannah's sale. He came to the kitchen late one night, Celia recalled. His face was different than I had ever seen it. Cold. Empty. Like something had died inside him. He asked his mother about the sugar operation. Wanted to know details. How many vats there were. How deep they were. How often they were cleaned. How the molasses was transferred. Ruth thought he was just curious about the work, maybe hoping to get assigned to the processing building where the labor was a bit less brutal than field work. But I could see something else in his eyes. Something calculating. He was planning something. Even then, I knew. Though I could not have imagined what. Moses spent the next 5 years learning everything he could about the sugar production process. He volunteered for the most dangerous jobs, the ones other people avoided, working in the boiling rooms where the heat was unbearable, transferring syrup from kettles to vats, cleaning the massive storage containers during the off-season when they were empty and accessible. Each task gave him new knowledge, new understanding of how the system worked, new ideas about how it might be exploited. He learned the dimensions of the vats, measured them carefully when he was assigned to clean them. 10 feet deep, 8 feet diameter, smooth metal walls, a single drain valve at the bottom, an observation platform around the top with metal railings. He learned about the viscosity of molasses, how it changed with temperature, how objects moved through it, how a person would sink, He tested this by dropping things into the vats when they were full. Pieces of wood, stones wrapped in cloth, watching how they sank, how long it took, how completely they disappeared beneath the dark surface. He learned about the Sugar Council and their habits, their monthly meetings, their practice of touring each other's facilities, their predictable routines. He paid attention when they visited Beaumont Plantation, observed how they moved in groups, how they discussed the operations with the casual confidence of men who believe themselves completely safe, how they leaned against railings and peered into vats, examining their investments with proprietary satisfaction. And he waited, because Moses understood something crucial that many enslaved people did not fully grasp. Patience was the ultimate weapon of the powerless. His masters thought in terms of quarterly profits and seasonal harvests. They were impulsive, confident in their power, careless because they believed themselves invulnerable. But Moses could think in years, could plan in detail, could wait for the perfect moment with the patience of someone who had nothing but time. He also began to build networks, quietly, carefully. He identified other enslaved people who had lost family members to the cruelty of the Sugar Council, who had watched loved ones worked to death, who carried their own rage and desire for revenge. He did not tell them his plans, did not trust anyone with the full picture, but he cultivated relationships, built trust, created a web of people who might help when the time came, even if they did not understand exactly what they were helping with. One of these people was Daniel, the plantation carpenter. Daniel was skilled, literate, despite laws against teaching enslaved people to read, and deeply angry about a system that had taken 3 of his children and sold them to plantations in Texas. Moses and Daniel developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared hatred of their circumstances. Another was Samuel, who worked in the grinding mill. Samuel had lost his wife when she collapsed from exhaustion during harvest and was left to die because calling a doctor would have cost money, and she was not considered worth the expense. He carried that grief like a physical weight and would have done anything to strike back at the men responsible. A third was Celia, the kitchen worker who had recognized something in Moses that night in 1846. Celia was older, wiser, connected to enslaved communities across multiple plantations through her work. She could pass information, could spread rumors, could create stories that would shape how people interpreted events. Moses did not tell these people he was planning to murder the Sugar Council, but he positioned them so they would be useful when the moment came. So they would vouch for him. So they would help create the narrative he needed. And through all of this, through 5 years of planning and positioning and learning, Moses maintained his mask of obedience. He was the perfect slave. Hardworking, uncomplaining, reliable. He showed no signs of the cold rage burning inside him, no hints of the elaborate plan taking shape in his mind. He was patient in ways his masters could never imagine. The opportunity Moses had been waiting for began to take shape in early 1851. William Beaumont announced that the November meeting of the Sugar Council would be held at Beaumont Plantation. The men would tour the new processing facility Beaumont had built the previous year. It featured the latest technology, steam-powered mills that could process twice as much cane as the old animal-powered models, improved boiling kettles with better temperature control, and 6 massive new storage vats, each capable of holding 4,000 gallons of molasses. Beaumont was proud of this facility. It represented the future of sugar production, more efficient, more profitable, a symbol of his success and innovation. He wanted his fellow council members to see it, to admire it, to recognize his superiority in adopting new methods. Moses knew this was his moment, After 5 years of waiting, the perfect circumstances were finally aligning. 7 men, in one location, at a predictable time, touring a facility where massive vats of molasses would be full and ready for processing. Everything he needed was coming together. He began the final preparations. Small actions that would seem innocent individually, but together formed a complete plan. This gave him access to the building in the days before the tour. Gave him time alone with the equipment. Time to make certain adjustments. He studied the observation platform that surrounded the vats. The metal railings were solid, properly installed, safe under normal circumstances. But Moses understood stress points. Understood that metal could be weakened without obvious signs. That small cuts in strategic locations could compromise structural integrity, while remaining invisible to casual inspection. He also initiated a conversation with Daniel, the carpenter, about the railings. Mentioned in passing that they seemed to flex a bit when leaned on. Suggested they might need reinforcing. Daniel, who took pride in his work, was immediately concerned. He inspected the railings carefully, found nothing wrong with them, assured Moses they were solid and safe. This was crucial. It established that the railings had been professionally inspected just days before the council visit, that they had been deemed safe by a skilled craftsman. This would be important later when questions were asked about how such a tragic accident could have occurred. Moses also paid careful attention to the harvest schedule. The council visit was planned for November 2nd, a Saturday. Processing would still be ongoing. The vats would be full or nearly full of molasses ready for shipment. The facility would be operating normally. Workers would be present. Everything would appear routine, safe, predictable. On October 29th, 3 days before the scheduled visit, Moses took a chisel and began his final preparation. He worked at night, in complete darkness, when the processing building was empty. He had spent so much time in the facility over the past 5 years that he could navigate it blind, knew exactly where every piece of equipment was located, could find his way to the observation platform without light. The railing around the vat platform was made of iron pipes, 2 inches in diameter, welded to vertical supports. Moses focused on 3 sections, each about 6 feet long, located at the point where the Sugar Council would naturally gather to look into the nearest vat. He used the chisel to make small, precise cuts on the underside of the pipes, where they would not be visible without getting down on hands and knees with a lantern. The cuts were not deep enough to compromise the structural integrity under normal use. A single person leaning against the railing would be fine. Even 2 or 3 people would be safe. But 7 men, all leaning forward simultaneously, all putting their combined weight on the weakened sections. That would be enough. The work took him 3 nights. He worked slowly, carefully, making sure each cut was perfect, making sure the weakened sections would hold for casual use, but fail catastrophically under the right pressure, making sure there would be no way to prove the failure was anything other than a tragic design flaw or manufacturing defect. By November 1st, everything was ready. The weakened railings were in place, invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. The vats were full of molasses, thick and dark and deadly. The Sugar Council was scheduled to arrive the next morning, and Moses was positioned exactly where he needed to be, part of the work crew that would be present during the tour, close enough to observe, close enough to act if necessary. Moses did not sleep that night. He lay in his narrow bed in the slave quarters, staring at the ceiling, reviewing every step of his plan. Had he missed anything? Was there any way it could go wrong? Any possibility that he would be caught? He could not think of any. He had been planning this for 5 years, had considered every contingency, had positioned everyone he needed positioned. Either it would work, or it would not. And if it did not work, if somehow his plan failed, at least he would die knowing he had tried, that he had refused to accept powerlessness, that he had struck back at the men who had destroyed his sister and countless others. But he was confident it would work. He had planned too carefully, waited too patiently. The pieces were all in place. Tomorrow the Sugar Council would gather at Beaumont Plantation. They would tour the new facility. They would lean against the railings to look into the Molasses Vats. And 7 men who thought themselves untouchable would learn that power is always an illusion. That safety is never guaranteed. That revenge can come from the most unexpected places. November 2nd, 1851 dawned clear and warm. A perfect Louisiana autumn day. Temperature in the 70s. Light breeze from the south carrying a smell of smoke from the grinding mills and the sweet, cloying scent of boiling sugar. The Sugar Council began arriving at Beaumont Plantation around 10 in the morning, their carriages rolling up the long drive lined with live oak trees. They were dressed in their finest, suits tailored in New Orleans, hats from New York, everything chosen to display their wealth and status. They greeted each other warmly, shaking hands, exchanging news and gossip. These monthly meetings were social events as much as business gatherings, opportunities to see and be seen, to reaffirm their position at the top of the parish hierarchy. William Beaumont played the host perfectly, welcoming each man, offering refreshments, making sure everyone was comfortable. He was proud of what he had built, eager to show it off, confident that his fellow council members would be impressed by his new facility and acknowledge his leadership in adopting modern methods. The tour began around 11. The 7 men walked together through the plantation grounds, Beaumont in the lead, pointing out improvements and explaining innovations. They visited the grinding mills first, watched the steam-powered machinery crushing cane stalks, extracting the juice, observed the efficiency of the new system. Then they moved to the boiling rooms, saw the improved kettles, watched enslaved workers stirring the thickening syrup, discussed the temperature controls and how they improved sugar quality. Beaumont explained everything in detail, clearly proud of his knowledge and success. Moses was there, part of the work crew, standing to the side, holding tools, appearing to be just another enslaved person going about assigned tasks, but watching, always watching, tracking the group's movement, calculating timing. Finally, around noon, the tour reached the storage area, the heart of the new facility. 6 massive vats in a row, each sitting on a raised platform, each connected by pipes to the boiling rooms. 4 of the vats were full or nearly full of dark molasses. 2 were empty, waiting to be filled. Beaumont led the group onto the observation platform that ran along the vats. It was designed to allow supervisors to check the filling levels and quality. A sturdy walkway made of wood planks supported by iron framework, with railings for safety. Or so everyone believed. The 7 men gathered at the edge of the platform, looking down into the nearest vat. The surface of the molasses was perhaps 2 feet below them. The liquid was dark, almost black, its surface perfectly still. It looked solid, almost like the ground, not like something that could swallow a man whole. Moses watched from his position near the entrance to the storage building. He had positioned himself there deliberately, close enough to see everything, close enough to act if necessary, but not so close that he would be immediately suspected. Just another enslaved worker. Invisible to men who had trained themselves not to really see the people they enslaved. This was the moment. Everything depended on the next few seconds. Moses had done everything he could. The railings were weakened. The vats were full. The 7 men were in position. Now he just needed them to lean forward, to put their weight on the compromised sections. William Beaumont gestured towards something in the vat. Some detail about the molasses quality or filling level. The exact words were not recorded, but the gesture made the others lean forward to see. 7 men pressing against the railing. Their combined weight, perhaps 1,400 pounds, concentrated on the sections Moses had carefully weakened. For a moment, nothing happened. The railing held, and Moses felt his heart sink. Had he miscalculated? Had the cuts not been deep enough? Had 5 years of planning come to nothing? Then the metal gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the storage building. The weakened sections of railing broke simultaneously. 7 men stumbled forward, suddenly unsupported. For perhaps half a second, they might have caught themselves, might have grabbed the intact sections of railing, might have stepped back. But Moses was already moving. Not to help, but to push. Hard, using his full weight and strength against the nearest men, shoving them forward into the open space where the railing had been. They fell into the vat. The first man hit the molasses surface face first. The others followed, some feet first, some sideways, all of them plunging into the thick, dark syrup. The sound was not what anyone might expect. No splash, no noise like falling into water. Just a heavy liquid thud, like someone dropping a sack of grain into mud, and then screaming, muffled, desperate, as 7 men realized they were sinking into something they could not swim through, could not climb out of, could not escape. Moses stepped back immediately, blended into the shadows near the entrance. His face showed appropriate shock, horror, the same expression everyone else wore. Inside he felt nothing but cold satisfaction. 5 years of planning, 5 years of waiting, and now, finally, revenge. The scene that unfolded over the next 40 minutes was one of horror and helplessness. The 7 men thrashed in the molasses. Their struggles only made things worse. Every movement exhausted them. The thick liquid worked into their clothes, making them heavier, pulled them down faster. Rescue attempts began immediately. Workers ran for ropes, lowered them into the vat. But the men could not hold onto them. Their hands were coated in thick syrup. Everything was slippery. Impossible to grip. They grabbed at the ropes desperately, but their fingers slid off. The molasses was everywhere. In their eyes, their nose, their mouth. Someone tried lowering a ladder, but the men were already too deep in the vat, too covered in syrup, too exhausted. They could not reach the ladder, could not climb even if they had reached it. They were drowning in molasses, and there was nothing anyone could do to save them. One by one, the screaming stopped. One by one, the struggling ceased. One by one, 7 of the most powerful men in St. Mary Parish sank beneath the surface of the molasses and disappeared. Their bodies pulled down by gravity and the weight of their syrup-soaked clothes. Down into the dark depths of the vat, down into the substance their wealth was built upon. William Beaumont was the last to die. Moses made sure he watched, made sure Beaumont saw him standing there at the edge of the crowd, made sure their eyes met for just a moment. And in that moment, Moses allowed his mask to slip, allowed Beaumont to see the cold satisfaction, the deliberate intent, the knowledge of exactly who was responsible for this. Beaumont's eyes went wide. Understanding dawned. But it was too late. His head disappeared beneath the molasses, and Moses knew that Beaumont's last thought was the realization that the slave he had barely noticed, the man whose sister he had sold away without a second thought, had orchestrated all of this, had killed him and 6 others, had won. The aftermath was chaos, enslaved people and overseers running everywhere, some trying to organize rescue efforts, others just standing in shock. The families of the dead men were notified. They arrived in hysterics. Doctors were summoned, though they could do nothing. The parish sheriff came to investigate, and gradually a story emerged. A terrible accident, a railing that had failed. 7 men who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was implausible, yes. 7 men all falling at once. But what was the alternative? Murder. By whom? And how would anyone have known all 7 would be standing there at that exact moment? Moses gave his account when questioned. He had been nearby, had seen the railing break, had tried to catch the men as they fell, had failed. He was obviously shaken by what he had witnessed. The questioners saw what they expected to see, a simple slave, traumatized by tragedy, telling the truth as he understood it. Daniel the carpenter was also questioned. He had inspected those railings just days before. They had been solid, safe, but metal fatigue could occur suddenly, a weak point not visible to inspection. These things happened. Tragic, but not suspicious. The official investigation concluded accidental death. No one was charged with any crime. No one was held responsible. The 7 bodies, once they were finally extracted from the molasses after 3 days of effort, were buried with full honors. The parish held a day of mourning. Churches offered prayers. Newspapers published lengthy obituaries praising the deceased as pillars of the community. And Moses continued his work, quiet, obedient, showing appropriate grief when discussing the tragedy. Inside, he felt the satisfaction of perfect revenge. He had killed 7 men who thought themselves untouchable, had watched William Beaumont die knowing who was responsible, had walked away without punishment. But he was not done, because 3 years later, in April 1854, Moses simply walked away from Beaumont Plantation and was never seen again. He disappeared into the network of people who helped runaways, made his way north through 1,000 miles of hostile territory, and vanished into history, carrying with him the knowledge of what he had accomplished. The legacy of Moses and the Molasses murders rippled through Louisiana for decades. The Sugar Council was never reformed. The power structure collapsed, and enslaved people throughout the region whispered the story of the man who drowned 7 masters and walked away free. A reminder that resistance was possible, that the powerful could fall. That revenge, however patient, eventually came. This is the story Louisiana tried to forget. But some stories refuse to stay buried. Some truths demand to be told. And Moses, wherever he ended his days, knew he had struck a blow that could never be undone. Remember his name. Remember what he did. Remember why he did it. And remember that the oppressed are always watching, always planning, always waiting for their moment.